All right, we've been looking at the budget speech presented by the Finance Minister today. Before that speech, the EFF, many of its members marched to Parliament. The party saying it was marching against dangerous loans from the IMF and World Bank. So let's look closely now at our relationship with these international lenders tonight. We cross to SABC News correspondent Nick Harper, who is at the head offices of the international financial institutions in Washington. Of course, thank you for being with us, Nick. The fear in South Africa has always been that we will get so deep into debt that we'll have to go with a begging bowl. There will be loans from the IMF or World Bank with strings attached, as there have been in the past. We are not there yet. There were some loans offered during COVID-19, and those were at pretty good interest rates. South Africa said it was taking up on those because there were no strings attached. That seemed like something good from these institutions offered to various countries around the world. In that context, just tell us what the role of these institutions is in the modern world.
You're right, Francis. Yes, especially in the last couple of years since the start of the pandemic, the IMF and the World Bank have been heavily focused on providing countries like South Africa with these special low interest rate loans. The idea being that this money is then used by South Africa to help with COVID-19 economic recovery. And the minister's budget is slightly different this time round to budgets that we've seen in the past, because it comes after 6 months of lending from both the IMF and the World Bank, the first loans that South Africa has taken on since the end of apartheid in 1994. Just to run you through the figures from these loans, the IMF has loaned South Africa $4.3 billion. That happened last July, and the IMF has added in $750 million, a development policy loan. They are low interest, but yes, there is that fear, as we've seen with the protests today, that South Africa would be burdened by debt for many years to come. We've seen in the past that when these institutions have loaned money to countries, there is this long-term impact that they find it difficult and struggle over many, many years to repay the loans, and it gets them into further financial problems, even though the original idea behind these loans is to rebuild economies after problems like the pandemic. The United Nations, for example, estimates that repayments each year around the world total $210 billion. That's just in interest payments, not the principal repayments, which are around $750 billion. So yes, there is this fear from South Africa. Like you say, we're not there yet, but there could be a longer term impact as it tries to repay these very substantial loans, even though they're at low interest rates. And that could hold back South Africa in the years to come with its own recovery. Yeah,
well, I guess where we are right now is if we're not taking low interest loans from the IMF or World Bank, we've got other lenders offering higher interest rates. So maybe it's useful for now, but the future is important. And even though these institutions are taking a lighter touch in some senses, there are still calls, are there not, for these Bretton Woods institutions to transform, to change.
Absolutely. And these reform calls have been going on for decades, dating back several decades, calling for reforms of the Bretton Woods institutions, so the IMF and the World Bank. They were set up, we have to remember, more than 75 years ago, at the end of the Second World War, back in 1944. The plan then was to rebuild the shattered global economy after the effects of that World War. And it worked. At the time, it helped to provide the prosperity that had been lacking for many years. But many critics in recent decades have said, look, that is the old world order. Things have changed dramatically since then. And they feel that the World Bank and the IMF need to keep up with those changes. Even the UN itself, that oversees these two institutions, has looked at the possibility of reform. It's laid out an agenda, a reform plan that runs until 2030. In that 2030 agenda, they call for a plan of action for the people, the planet and prosperity, similar to the original 1944 Bretton Woods plan. But there is that feeling that essentially the IMF and the World Bank, even though they're giving these loans that are meant to help with prosperity, are essentially a bank and are putting countries into deeper debt.
And many African countries, many countries around the world are burdened with mountains of debt, this huge challenge to pay it back. What about them right now?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, especially countries that are feeling the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic, that have already seen their own economies within their countries, let alone the impacts of the global economy, really taking a toll, in unemployment rising in many countries. And there is this problem of trying to have a balancing act between repaying these international institutions and also rebuilding their own individual economies. The minister spoke about this during his budget. He laid out South Africa's own debt, pointing to the fact, in his words, he said that the debt burden remains a matter of serious concern, that the government will reach 4.3 trillion rand this year. And there is that fear of trying to stabilise internal debt while also repaying the international institutions. I mean, really any country will have to have that balancing act between the two. But I guess there is that criticism that perhaps the World Bank and the IMF don't really help in the ways that they were originally set up to do so, and only saddle countries like South Africa with enormous levels of debt.
All right, Nick, before we let you go, the South African markets looking at the budget speech today, it's been called a good news budget, but of course there's also the issue of Russia sending troops into parts of Ukraine that it's recognized as independent areas. What's happening right now? What's the latest from the White House?
Yeah, we are expecting a fresh round of sanctions later in the day. Remember that on Tuesday, the US President Joe Biden, in concert with his European allies, the European Union, the United Kingdom, put out a whole range of sanctions. The US in particular sanctioning 2 Russian banks, also saying that it would sanction oligarchs, Russia's elite and their families, and also target Russia's ability to access Western financing. That all happened on Tuesday, but President Biden said that was just the first tranche, that there would be more to come. We are expecting, potentially later on Wednesday or at some point this week, sanctions on the company that controls the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. That's the pipeline that runs from Russia to Germany, the idea to transport gas to Germany. Now, we saw Olaf Scholz, the Chancellor of Germany, 24 hours ago, halting final certification of that pipeline, essentially putting the project on pause. President Biden, though, is expected to sanction the company that is in charge of the pipeline. Sanctions that he himself blocked a year ago when he entered office. If he lets those sanctions go ahead, the thinking is it effectively kills off that pipeline project. The plan was to supply Germany with a huge amount of Russian gas and make them somewhat energy reliant on Russia. But President Biden always said that if an invasion were to take place, that pipeline project would be taken off the table. So those sanctions would essentially draw that red line under that pipeline project, killing it off for good.
Yeah, and highlighting just how intertwined all these economies are. Thank you very much, SABC News correspondent Nick Harper in Washington.